Margarita, welcome to AI to Peace.
Thank you, Jeremy. I am thrilled to be here today.
So, the first thing I'd like to ask you is could you tell us about yourself and your journey?
Well, I'm an engineer by training, and I'm a behavior designer by practice. And now I am working in the area of peace technology and peace innovation, and it has become my life's work. So, my background, Silicon Valley, launched startups, bit of venture capitalist. I've run corporate innovation labs, and I've taught hundreds of executives at Stanford. But the thing that I really, really care about is peace, and I'm the executive director of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford. And there, we don't ask, how do we stop war? So when you ask people about peace, they immediately go to war, right? We don't do that. What we ask is what systems, behaviors, and designs make peace more likely by default, right? How do we change our environment? How do we change our context so that peace just happens, naturally in the world? And, peace isn't a vibe. It's an infrastructure, right? It's how we design the world, how we build the world. And as a woman, I find increasingly that I'm coming at this with a feminist perspective, and particularly a feminist engineering perspective. Because, most systems weren't designed by women, but I'm enormously curious about what the world would look like if women were more in charge or were making a bigger contribution in terms of how we build our environment and society. And so that's what I'm focused on, not really about fixing the past, but really building what's going to come next for all of us.
Margarita, thank you for that. Incredible. The next thing that I'd like to ask you is when you hear the phrase AI to peace, hashtag AI to peace, what's the reality of that outcome?
Well, it's possible, but only if we stop treating peace like poetry. It's like something that can't be designed, and start treating it as if it was a product launch. Okay, here I am talking like a Silicon Valley person. So it's something that you design. It's something that's intentional, because right now what's happening with AI is it's being used exceptionally well to destabilize democracy and consolidate power. We can see that going on right now. It's in the headlines, right? So AI isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. I mean, think about the intentionality behind that, about weaponizing AI, right? And stripping us of human rights and all that. That is not by accident. That is by design. So what we have to do is flip the question. And it's not about how can AI promote peace, but why have we allowed it to be optimized for outrage, manipulation, and control? Really? I mean, I think we need to call people on how they're using the technology, because typically the argument is technology is morally neutral. But you know what? People aren't, and designers aren't, and engineers aren't. And so we should be calling them, why are you allowing AI to be used this way? Right? And I think that's important for us to call, quite honestly, forgive my French, the bullshit on this. Because until we start to say, why are you designing it with this intention? Because that's the outcome that we're getting. And it's not by accident. It's not going to change.
What can we do about that? We live in a world where we have nuclear weapons and, those bombs have been used and there's, talk about them being used again, God forbid. I mean, how can we police this, if you like? How can we make sure that the coders are coding in an appropriate way?
Well, one, I think we need to have some standards, right? I think that, people think about peace and peace technology as something that's very soft, right? And in the Valley, the big thing that's in vogue right now is defense tech, right? Because they say we can make a lot of money on defense tech. And that makes me nervous, because you don't want a defense tech unicorn. Because if you have a defense tech unicorn, that means you have more conflict, right? And what we've learned in the United States with the for-prison profit complex is that if you make something for profit, you will find a way to feed that beast so that way it can continue to be profitable, right? And so I'm concerned very much about defense tech. So one is having dialogues like this to make people aware, right? And then the other is, how do we support people who do want to design technology in an ethical way, which means we need to look at engineering education. We need to change the incentives. How do we bring justice into engineering curriculum So when engineers are designing something and they're saying, okay, I'm just trying to make this work, they go, yes, you need to make this technically work. Okay, does it function? But also, does it function as a social context, right? Is it causing harm or is it breaking things? Because then that's a bad spec, right? Just as we wouldn't want to buy a toaster that sets your bread on fire because you go, okay, that is a failure as a toaster. We shouldn't have technology that sets society on fire.
I completely agree with you. What's your greatest fear? Is it how AI is being utilized in relation to defense tech? Is that your greatest fear? What's your greatest fear about AI?
My fear isn't like this science fiction fear about AI. It's more strategic. I fear a world where we're automating domination, right? Where every prompt, every policy, and every platform is shaped by the few. And these people who weren't elected, right? Some guys in some back room, some guys who are funded by venture capital, who are making these decisions that are affecting everyone on the globe. And that's what worries me, because there's no sunlight there. There's no oversight, and as my father would say, we came by this honestly, because for a lot of startups, they're getting money from venture capitalists and they're saying, you have to grow, so you have to do whatever you need to do to grow. A couple of years ago, we did an industry survey because we were trying to promote more ethics in technology. And the feedback that we got from startups was, one, they were pointing the finger at Facebook because the Netflix documentary had just come out about, Facebook's so bad. They go like, oh, this is terrible. And I go, fantastic. So what kind of an ethics team do you have in your company? And most people said, well, we don't have any. And I go, well, do you have a person who's looking at ethics in your company? They said, well, we don't have any. And I said, well, why don't you? And they said, well, it's a luxury, right? So people think that doing the right thing and designing your product so that it's safe from a society level scale is expensive. And we need to change that. We need to flip the script and say, like, no, that spec of making it safe for everybody has to be there from the very, very beginning. And until we resolve that and change the incentives and change the culture of how technology is developed, it's not going to change. And that's what scares me. That's what really scares me.
In relation to AI, do you think it has the ability to be harnessed for a more peaceful and sustainable world? Maybe give me an example of how it can.
Absolutely. I think, again, technology is just a tool, and it's how we apply it in the world, right? So we can engineer for peace in the same way that we've engineered for dominance, right? So peace isn't the opposite of conflict. It's the opposite of oppression. So we need to think about how we design AI to increase agency, transparency, and equity. And I think that's sort of like the peace tech stack. We need to think about how do we incorporate justice, right? What does engineering justice look like? The same way as environmental justice and everything else. And that's a topic that hasn't been really considered in the technical world, right? So, for instance, there was a very seminal paper that I always have my students look at, and it's called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And it was written by Langdon Winter in the early 1980s. And he would go like, artifacts have politics? Like, how could this have politics? And he talked about how when New York was redeveloped in the 50s, Robert Moses made very deliberate choices about the height of bridges, like overpasses, right? So how you're driving along and sometimes you'll see an overpass and it tell you that like vehicles over this height can't pass through. And you go, and you kind of like, I wonder why that is. Like, is it an old bridge and was it before vehicles got taller, or, what was that all about? Well, that was intentional to keep public buses from going into specific neighborhoods, right? So he was using civil engineering and bridges in particular as a political tool to keep poor people out of more affluent neighborhoods, because he assumed that poor people would be on those public buses, right? So everything that we do, everything that is designed is political, right? And so if we're thinking about how we can use AI for better, then we think, okay, AI is a political tool. How do we use it to support care work? How do we use it to translate? AI, it's amazing what you can do in terms of AI translators. It allows us to connect. How do we use AI to help us model cooperation at scale, right? If we look at how do we detect the quiet successes? Because AI has all this training data, it can just sort of absorb this data and let us know patterns of the good things that are happening in the world and how do we amplify them, right? How do we increase cooperation and collaboration? We see that right now. We're all discovering this right now in the trade war that we're in, because we're all of a sudden, everyone on TikTok is getting schooled on supply chain. It's like, oh, I had no idea that a semiconductor chip, there might be 30 countries involved in the production of that chip. That's 30 countries that are cooperating, that are working together peacefully to make a technology that benefits all of us, right? And that's sort of like, I think of that as like everyday retail piece, because that's sort of under the radar. We don't realize the level of coordination that needs to happen for something like a chip to be produced, right? And that means we have to get along well enough. We have to coordinate, it's a mutualist behavior, because if I'm not doing my part, that means that you can't do your part. And so we already do peace at scale in this, in these complex supply chains.
Thank you, Margarita. That was amazing. If people would like to support you on your journey, how can they do that?
Well, first of all, invite me into the rooms where peace hasn't been considered a design constraint, right? I want to get in front of people and say, look, this is something that is important. You've probably overlooked it, but guess what? We now have the capability to do this, right? And let me open your eyes to the potential of that, to make your whatever it is that you're doing more distinctive, and set you apart from your competition. But more than that, it helps future-proof the world that you actually want to live in, right? We all want to live in a world that's abundant, that's flourishing, that's peaceful. So, get me in front of those people so I can do that. The second thing is funding. For so many of us who are working in this field, we're so underfunded, right? It's overlooked. But I think that peace, especially now, given how volatile the world has become just in a matter of 8 weeks, right? People who are working on this, we need to do like DARPA level funding on new ways to create a more peaceful, stable world than we have ever had. DARPA invested so much money to create the internet back in the 60s and 70s in the United States. Imagine, if you will, that we had that level of commitment to fund, the technologies, the frameworks, the education, so that way we would have a more stable world. So that's the other thing that I'm looking at. And then help us rewrite the cultural script. Because when people talk about peace, I sometimes get the sense that they think I'm a beauty queen and I'm quite naive to aspire to work on peace, that is impossible. However, if you think about your everyday life and you wake up in the morning, you have your coffee, you go to work, you're walking down the street, you're walking your dog, you're living in a state of peace. We're already there. And the question is, how do we make it more sustainable, right? If it's peaceful today, how do we make sure it's peaceful tomorrow and 10 years from now? And I don't think that's a naive aspiration at all. In fact, I think that's like the number one thing we should be working on if we love ourselves, our family, our children, and the future. It's an absolute priority.
Finally, if there was one film, book, or resource that you would recommend if anybody was interested in AI, what would it be?
Well, Branka Panik, she runs AI for Peace, and she just published a book on AI for Peace. And so she talks about all the different ways that AI can be used and that it is being used to promote peace in the world. If you want to understand more what I'm really getting into now in terms of what is a world that was designed by women for everyone, I would look at Invisible Women. It's a great book by Carolina Criado Perez. Langdon Winter wrote this paper called Do Artifacts Have Politics? It's very short, but it tells you about how systems encode values, whether we name them or not. And then, come and look at us at peaceinnovation.stanford.edu. You can get in touch with me through LinkedIn.
Amazing. Margarita, thank you so much. It's amazing speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's always a privilege and an honor to talk with you.